Hello, everyone, and welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We are so excited to be here with all of you talking about COP30 and the trends, the declarations, the sort of general vibe and feel and excitement that came out of Brazil last week. So thank you for joining us. COP30, as we all know, is a big moment for food and agriculture. We've heard maybe the most consequential COP yet. We've all heard a lot about the gridlock. We've all heard a lot about the dialogue, and here we have both Alexander and Ethan to talk to us about sort of also what happened sort of between the lines. What happened in dinners, what happened on panels, what happened in conversation. Alex is probably going to talk about what happened on the soccer field. With that, I'm going to actually just dive right into it. Alexander Gillett is the CEO at HowGood. Ethan is our Chief Innovation Officer, and we were lucky to have them on the ground in both Sao Paulo and Belém. So I'll be bringing some questions to them to sort of illuminate the conversations that happened at COP in Brazil. And I really welcome all of you to drop your own questions in the chat as well. So we'll leave lots of time at the end, sort of open up conversation to what you're most interested in hearing about. And of course, always opportunities to continue the conversation after this half an hour as well. But right before I dive right in, I also want to bring up two other webinars that HowGood has coming up in December and January. So we do lots of webinar series, and I'm bringing this up largely because we've got lots of new folks on the call today. Lots of webinars specifically for the food and beverage industry and all things related to sustainability. So these are coming up in December and January. Dates are not set yet, but they will be very soon. Kate, my colleague, can go ahead and drop a link into the chat. Feel free to sign up, and we'll let you know when those dates are finalized. All right, and with that, all right. Alexander and Ethan. So, to start, Alex, if you could just kind of paint the picture for us all. We know that COP was spread this year throughout Brazil in several different cities. You were joining the talks in Sao Paulo. Ethan, you were in Belém. Alexander, can you take a minute just to break down the sort of structure and focus in each city, just to set a little bit of context for us all here?
Yeah, so in São Paulo, there was more of a focus on business and coalitions and strategizing for what would transpire in Belém. It happens beforehand. In the past, um, it was kind of a opportunity where if you think of it as a Venn diagram for business and then COP to overlap a little bit more and share kind of directional understandings of how the different forces at play are affecting each other. And in an ideal world, um, actually work towards solutions that both parties need. So, like, business needs certain new regulations or certain regulations change to allow for regenerative agriculture. To be paid out at the same rate in certain countries for their via insurance, right? So that can be a really important thing where business and governments need to work together. The challenge during this COP was the separation meant there was less overlap, and so you had to go to both. And so there was less people who were like, oh, I can do one and then the other. And so one of the things that we started to see was just this, there was a different structure to this event. And then we obviously had Belém in the jungle, the main event happening there, the negotiations happening there, and some presence from kind of both sides of the business and the government aisle, but predominantly government. Less of a showing of business than we think would be ideal in terms of their ability to show up for commitments. There was maybe more of a showing of lobbyists for certain groups than we would have liked there, which has been pretty well documented. So I won't go too much into that.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
And Ethan, from your perspective in Belém, what was the vibe? What kind of role did food and agriculture play? Was it different than years past? What was the sort of energy that you felt both in the blue zone and the green zone and sort of throughout Belém?
The vibe was it was full on. It was hot. It was focused. It was diverse. It was the city was alive. It felt closer to Cali, the biodiversity COP in Cali, than others that I had been through. The green zone was bumping every day, full of young people, old people, totally open to the public. We had a greater indigenous participation in COP, both within the accredited folks who were there. Of the 55,000 or so, there's 3,000 indigenous delegates, but there was also indigenous community and popular community happening around COP itself. There was a flotilla of 300 boats that came down the river on one of the early days. There was a United Peoples March that happened. There was indigenous protesters twice who sort of broke into the blue zone. One of the times the COP president himself actually came out and met with them and talked and like listened to their concerns. There's some great photos and good coverage of that. So that was encouraged. It wasn't like this terrible thing. It was like, let's have all the voices heard. We also saw, I think for the first time, a sort of dedicated agri-zone, which was about 15 minutes from the main venue. And that agri-zone both showcased the work of Embrapa, one of the Brazilian sort of research agricultural agronomic agency. And there was a whole other conference. There was like 400 events at the AgriZone, as well as the hundreds of events that were at COP. So food was present. It was important, especially at Regen House, which was our venue where we hosted dinners and cocktails and events and sort of gatherings. Food was very much there. That's the focus of Regen House. I would say food did not end up featuring as much as we wanted in the formal negotiations. Some of the discussion was pushed to the intercessional that happens in Bonn. And despite the work of us and many of the folks, even who are on this call, we have some amazing people joining who are organizers and supporting the great work of integrating food into COP, which wasn't even really on the agenda. Like it's 2 years ago, it really started to come in Sharm el-Sheikh. I could feel it growing. It's still not as front and center as we believe it should be because we think food is this incredible solution, this opportunity for agroecology, for regenerative food systems to kind of lift up and bring together the energy of climate and nature and justice and water and biodiversity all together. So it didn't have as much of a showing as we wanted, but it was there, and I would say there's still a sense of its growth.
Great. And I'm gonna ask you guys some questions about food as a solution rather than food as the problem, which it can sometimes be framed as. And I think all of us on this call are trying to change that. I'm gonna ask you the questions about that a little later on. For now, Ethan, I'm gonna come to you. We're gonna talk a little bit about the conversations that were had during the week, and then after that, we'll start to look forward a little bit, especially for all of us on this call where are the most important places to be placing our energy over time. But for now, Ethan, you mentioned HowGood hosted Regen House in Belém, which brought together players sort of across the industry, public and private sector, sort of more intimate, like heads down conversations. What were some of the key themes that you heard from the sessions that were hosted? That maybe don't always come up on a big public panel, but are really important conversations to be had.
I think three themes I would point to. One of them is that integration that I was just speaking to. There's also the sense there's the Rio Trio. There's three different conventions that are out there, one on biodiversity, a different one on desertification and soils, and a different one on climate. There was actually a formal statement of like, hey, we should start to bring those together. And as we saw representatives from UNCCD, UNFCCC, UNCBD kind of coming to Regen House, that idea of, okay, food could be part of the force that unites these was a theme that we heard throughout. We also heard a lot around finance and blended capital finance and new financing instruments. And in a lot of ways, some of the most exciting things from my perspective that came out of COP were not in the formal negotiations, but they were announcements both that happened in Sao Paulo, like the Tropical Forest Forever facility, which has now close to 7 billion in commitments to protect tropical forests forever. We had a joint statement on fertilizers from Brazil and the UK government with some positive thinking about, nitrogen and nutrient use efficiency getting better. And then we were really glad to help launch RAIS, which is an accelerator for restoring degraded lands around the world that has a huge amount of support and energy coming out of it, as well as the Alliance for Champions, which is these high ambition countries that are putting food systems at the center of their policy and also in how they're integrating with their nationally determined contributions and their work on climate. 3 new countries joined that Alliance of Champions, which is exciting. So finance is at the core. How do we get innovative financing? We had banks, we had investors, we had venture capitalists, we had funds all showing up to think about how do we get financing moving more? What are the business cases to get more money flowing into food? And then I guess the third thing I'll just note, the third theme is the COP negotiation process is a trying one. Getting 180 of anything to agree in a consensus way on something is hard, much less the nations of the world. And so there's this sense that while we can make step-by-step incremental progress with the negotiations, that this parallel part of COP, which I now see more clearly as the action agenda, which is an official term. There's the convention, then there's the action agenda. And the action agenda does not need to wait for consensus. It doesn't even need a majority. Anyone can put forward an initiative that's in line with the goals of going towards 1.5 degrees. And there were all those initiatives I just named were sort of part of the action agenda, which is run by the high level champions, which you could just get involved in. There's a great site we can put in the chat there. There's all these initiatives, over 400 they documented, where private sector, public sector, civil society actors can step up and contribute to these big initiatives going forward, even if we don't get as far as we want to on the agreements.
Great. Thank you so much. So much went down. Speaking of the action agenda and what happened there, Alex, one of the themes that we've heard over time is that there's a real focus on sort of coming together to figure out how do we measure progress and how do we measure reduction? What are the sort of pilots that are taking off that start to signal efforts that work? Is this some of what you heard again this year, or was there more of a shift sort of beyond that kind of measurement and reduction from what you heard?
I mean, I would say, fortunately, there is a shift. It's not that there isn't a place for pilots. They are very valuable, but they also only have so much impact. And so I think we've had an enormous number of pilots, and there's a lot of data to create action on. We can still improve and still do more pilots on top of that, right? But the shift right now that's happening in the conversation is scaling up, right? And the things that I heard, some of the largest and most committed companies, the ones who did show up, speak about, is the scaling up of their impact in a way that was truly meaningful towards their goals. And that's a shift. That's definitely, 2 years ago, it was all pilot programs and like how we measure and that side of things. So we've kind of gone from how we measure to these pilot programs to how can we actually start to scale this up as a predominant theme of the leading players, not of every player, obviously. But that's really important that shift is starting to happen, and people in the meetings are talking about the problems with that, the challenges with that, and trying to solve those rather than the theoretical side of it. And yeah, so I think I felt a lot of excitement around that side of things, and that beginning of that shift. And it was like, well, at least the actors who are in the room are saying that, and hopefully the actors who aren't in the room are doing that. And from what we've seen with our partners, there are big pushes happening, maybe couched in different language than we're typically speaking about. And maybe we'll dive more into that side of things later, of this kind of risk versus sustainability versus resilience and how it all comes together. But that was very much at play with how people are struggling with this, and it's part of the solution. It was very interesting. I think in Sao Paulo, all the events happened. They ended on Saturday, and suddenly like Saturday night there was a big final event, And then afterwards, we went out with some of the local delegation who were there to represent local farmers. And they took us to like a small dive samba bar. And we went samba dancing, which was pretty amazing, and watched incredible drummers and incredible dancers. And just the scene was really beautiful. And much of what you like, the parts that I brought home with so much heart was the culture and love that of the interactions of the people. But when you were sitting outside the bar in the cool air and chatting with the locals, their main questions were around like, does America not care about this, and how will that affect me? And that was it was I mean it was really powerful to hear. Um, and it was powerful to hear many times. Like the next day, I had Sunday again, and one of the things I was walking through the Ibiza Park, or just, this giant, gorgeous park, and there was like a soccer field, and I went and I played soccer with some like 15-year-old boys who were incredible at soccer, unsurprisingly. Um, and Afterwards, they were taking out their phones and using Google Translate to ask me these same very questions, and they were worried about it, and that side, yeah, it surprised me, it touched me, it moved me towards like the importance of the work, and especially I think them being 15 and knowing how much impact this would have on their lives, especially as they get older. Um, yeah, it was very moving.
So this speaks to the sort of like juxtaposition that I think we've heard a lot about with the sort of on the ground realities of farmers, of the indigenous communities in Brazil, and then the larger corporate environment. Ethan, you talked about the agrizone in place for the first time. Alexander, you talked about more lobbyists than usual. We've all probably heard about corporate capture. How good is sort of in this unusual position of sitting at the intersection of like data-informed climate action and big business. And we've always felt that there's huge opportunity throughout. Ethan, this question's for you. How did this kind of tension show up at COP30? And really the question that I want to hear is for all of us on the phone here who also probably feel a lot of tension in this juxtaposition. What do you think people should be taking away?
Yeah. I'm gonna comment just one last little thing on what Alexander was saying. Also, there was a statement that was going around when the U.S. Shamefully, I think, pulled out of participating and negotiating and really sending a delegation. There's this thing that went around that said 195 minus one equals 194. Referring to there's still 194 countries coming together to think together about the state of the world and what we can do together. And it's true, the US didn't show up, and I feel sad about that. And I wish that we had, and I'm grateful to those folks from the US who did go. And the US did still have a presence through its businesses, especially, and its civil society. And so I think, there was a sense of us figuring out and thinking about how to contribute, even if not in the sort of official negotiating path. There's sort of this tale of two cops in a way of those official standard negotiations, and then everything else that there's more agency and freedom to act on around it. Yeah, I think there's real legitimate concerns about corporate capture at COP and beyond in the processes, and the companies that have significant financial capital to invest in particular directions of outcomes of regulation or deregulation are significant and not something to take lightly. I think what we found in hosting both farmers and indigenous community members at Regen House and some of the biggest food companies in the world, some of whom have really significant impact. But then also we hosted some of the NGOs that are pushing against that from an investment perspective, and aiming for less meat and more plants, or aiming for more agroecology and less large-scale intensive agriculture. I think what we found is that the conversations were not acrimonious. They were not angry. They were constructive and focused on what the path forward was, regardless of what sort of group somebody was from, and that there was this real sense of, we need Nestle and PepsiCo and ADM and Bunge and Cargill and JBS. We have to have conversations with them and show them the reality of the impact they're having, but then also, convene around solutions. I was at a panel in the Blue Zone where a quite strong, excellent, and some would say activist organization that focuses on, pushing away from meat and towards, plant-based foods also sat on stage with a major retailer, Carrefour in the Middle East, and one of the largest meat companies in the world, Marfrig. And this activist organization lauded Marfrig for being the first of all the big meat companies to publish targets on methane. And so, in many ways, these are opposed organizations and people, and yet they were able to come together, find common ground, and seek to push the rest of the industry forward. So, while I think there's a legitimate concern and something we should be watching, there was the spirit that the COP presidency put forward of this global mutirao, this global coming together for shared work, that permeated even in places that had some tension in them.
Thanks so much. Feel free to drop any questions that you all have for Alexander and Ethan. There's one right there. I'm going to continue on this theme of the sort of the upside and the opportunity. So for a lot of big food and agriculture companies, COP30 can represent some risk. There's potentially anticipated regulation. There's more scrutiny. However, there's also a chance for business opportunity, right? Via climate financing, renewed focus on sustainable procurement, attention for those who are doing really good work. Where did you, and this is a question for either one of you, where did you see these kinds of like upsides show up? How are companies really capturing the opportunity that arose from COP?
I mean, I think one of the things that we're seeing trending is companies, especially within the food sector, are not just like risk here isn't theoretical, right? The risk is impacting them directly right now. Some industries specifically more, right? So obviously coffee and cacao are getting hit hard. Prices are being driven up in manners that we've never seen before, right? There was not enough chocolate produced compared to demand, and the amount of arable land that can produce chocolate is expected to decline year on year. So like that is a risk that is hitting their bottom lines right now. And the CEOs of those companies, of anyone using caffeine from in any of their products from coffee or selling directly coffee, is talking about that. And so the interesting thing is risk and compliance are something where budgets are typically spent. And so the opportunity for these companies is there is enough clarity and data now around the risks and how this is going to start to hit their supply chains more and more, where investing in it isn't really an option if you're thinking long term. So yes, short term, you can focus on not fixing the issue, but there's awareness there that long term, it's then going to hit you harder. And so I'm seeing people talk about this in a way and also say, like, we have budget for risk, right? In a way that they honestly didn't for a term like sustainability. But there is a shift there where actually what they're doing is the sustainability work under the guise of risk. And so part of me also thinks of risk, or even the term resilience right now, as a bucket where people are using it to do the work that they are trying to do anyway. And to shift the conversation away from like, do you care about this, and really just focused on the metrics and the outcomes. And I love that. Metrics and outcomes, I'm all about it. I don't care what you call it as long as you do the good work.
Yeah, absolutely. Adopt whatever rhetoric is going to work for you and your organization. Ethan, I have a question for you that has come in about interaction between the cities and regions hub and other city networks on the sort of like food, climate, cities nexus.
This is such
Where
a
you want to talk
cool,
about
yeah, I love this
that?
question. Love this thinking. Like, I think we're going to see as the sort of global unity and forward progress that we were feeling for a bit has shuddered a little with this moment of geopolitical complexity. I do think that we're going to see coalitions of those who want to move stepping forward and pushing. And I think cities are an awesome part of this. So, yeah, we did have a number of conversations there that were focused around these pockets of where there is will to move forward and sort of become those islands of coherence, those like little nucleuses of, well, here's what it can look like to move things forward. We're actively exploring how good's data being used for cities. Usually we work with companies to calculate their footprint and create ideas for decarbonization and improving biodiversity and water quality, et cetera. We're looking right now, and anybody who wants to talk about this, I'd be glad to dig in on how do we shift our software platform to make that data fit for a city or a jurisdiction or even a whole nation. We're also in discussion with FAO and the roadmap on that side. I will note there's another question here about deforestation. There's a bunch of things that didn't actually happen, right? We didn't get strong wording on deforestation. We didn't get a strong enough wording on fossil fuels. But then what happened? Brazil was like, well, fuck it, we're going to work on it anyway. Let's do a voluntary, like those who want to work on this, come, let's get together and work on it. So I don't want to see multilateralism break down and disappear entirely. I do think there's value in seeking that consensus. And we did get consensus, for example, on a new global goal for adaptation, including almost 60 indicators that can be used to track adaptation. There was a commitment, weaker than we wanted, for tripling adaptation finance. So there are things that move forward, but they're little steps, and we're going to have a lot of agency and get together so others want to move things forward to actually push for the change that's necessary.
Absolutely. One last question for each of you before we wrap, and this went by very quickly. What would you say is the like one or two actions that companies on this call should take immediately, right, to stay ahead of the direction that we started to see COP30 pushing us towards? Alexander, I'll start with you.
I mean, I think that this is one of those issues where the the complexity often forestalls action. And so my hope, and from most of the companies that I've spoken to, is there is a sense of what you should be working on, right? There's a sense of where the biggest challenges and therefore also your biggest opportunities for shift are going on. Um, there's also clarity within um, the agricultural community as to what best practices are and how we can shift the vast majority for all of the major commodity crops, but also for a lot of the smaller crops, like what we can be doing within a given region to really improve outcomes. And so, like, taking on starting to make those shifts, or if you've already done that, doing that step that we're hearing the companies start to commit to now, which is scaling that. Like, now is the time to do that, right? And if you need support on that, we're happy to show up, but we're also happy to share resources. I think now is the time where, like, 3 years from now, the companies that started scaling their action will be lauded, right? Like, if you have a 2030 target, it takes time for these farms to convert. So, like, you need to be getting into the weeds of them starting right now to have the outcomes that you've probably committed to by 2030.
Yeah, 2030 used to sound like a long time away, not so much anymore. Ethan, one or two actions that you think companies should take now.
I really think go check out the action agenda. I put the links in early on, and like there's 700 initiatives cataloged, 400 active. They have this granary of solutions that they're starting to build out. There's so many ways to get involved, finding the close to you or pertinent to you initiatives that are in motion, whether it's soil degradation, tropical forests, fertilizer. Like, there's a bunch that you can just go and get involved in, regardless of where you're sitting. And that's also a window into the broader COP process. There's the negotiation, there's the water, and then there's just the social capital of people around the world who are gathering. There's a WhatsApp group. If any of you are into food systems and aren't in the WhatsApp group, I'll let us know. We'll get you into it, where there's people talking about every day the small and large actions that we can take. So this is going to take a global community, and we're really glad to have you all here as part of it, thinking with us, looking forward with us. Let's see how we can yeah, make food a big part of the solution on the way to 2030.
Thank you both so much. We'll include these resources in our follow-up webinar recording, and lots of ways to continue this conversation. Again, thank you. Thank you for the great questions and for the dialogue there. And we'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.